Animalogy is brought to you by you, the listeners of this podcast. You get the content you love, and I get to create content for you and the world to consume. It's a win-win for everyone, and there's swag. By signing up at patreon.com/Colleen Patrick-Goudreau, listener supporters get to have the satisfaction that they're making this podcast possible, and they get some pretty awesome perks besides. Some listener supporters get written transcripts to each and every episode, helpful for a podcast about language, and some get bonus materials and bonus podcast episodes. Whatever category you fall into, thank you for supporting Animalogy, changing the way the world talks and thinks about animals. Welcome to Animalogy, a podcast about the animal-related words and expressions we use every day and how they reflect and affect our relationship with animals. I'm Colleen Patrick-Goudreau. Today's inaugural episode is Inauguration on a Wing and a Prayer. In this episode, our inaugural episode, we're going to expose the animals hiding in this, our inaugural episode. And if you haven't gotten the hint already, there's an actual animal lurking in the word inaugural. Hi, everyone. This is Colleen Patrick-Goudreau, and thank you so much for joining me. I'm a lover of words, a lover of animals, which I believe makes me a zoolinguophile, my favorite newly minted word. And by virtue of your listening to Animalogy, you may be as well. So welcome. Before we begin, I just want to let you know that you can find my work, my books, my Food for Thought podcast, of which there are over a decade of episodes at ColleenPatrickGoudreau.com, or you can go straight to animalogypodcast.com to leave your comments and questions about this podcast. I look forward to hearing from you. You can also subscribe to this podcast at iTunes, Stitcher, and SoundCloud. And please share this podcast and leave a review. It's one of the best ways you can help others find Animalogy. For our first inaugural episode about animals and language, what better place to start than with the word inauguration, which is the act of starting something new. The adjective inaugural means first, opening, maiden, introductory. And indeed, here we are. It's also timely because, as many of you know, if you're alive, that the United States of America democratically elects a new president every 4 years. And ever since George Washington, our first president, inaugurated in 1789, new presidents give an inaugural address during their inauguration. The day a presidential inauguration occurs is known as Inauguration Day, and it takes place on January 20th or on the 21st if the 20th falls on a Sunday. The only inauguration element mandated by the United States Constitution is that the president make an oath before he or she can enter on the execution of the office of the presidency. But it's become quite a grand affair at this point with parades and poems, prayers, parties, and speeches.
So first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
We are one nation and one people. Our fate as a nation and our future as a people rests not upon one citizen, but upon all citizens.
My friends, we are not the sum of our possessions. They are not the measure of our lives. In our hearts, we know what matters. We cannot hope only to leave our children a bigger car, a bigger bank account. We must hope to give them a sense of what it means to be a loyal friend, a loving parent, a citizen who leaves his home, his neighborhood, and town better than he found it.
The divide of race has been America's constant curse. And each new wave of immigrants gives new targets to old prejudices. Prejudice and contempt, cloaked in the pretense of religious or political convictions, are no different.
For we know that our patchwork heritage is a strength, not a weakness. We are a nation of Christians and Muslims, Jews and Hindus, and non-believers. We are shaped by every language and culture, drawn from every end of this earth. And because we have tasted the bitter swill of civil war and segregation and emerged from that dark chapter stronger and more united, we cannot help but believe that the old hatreds shall someday pass, that the lines of tribes shall soon dissolve, that as the world grows smaller, our common humanity shall reveal itself, and that America must play its role in ushering in a new era of peace.
Of course, those are some famous clips from inaugural addresses by President Franklin Roosevelt in 1933, John F. Kennedy in 1961, Lyndon B. Johnson in 1965, George H.W. Bush in 1981, Bill Clinton in 1993, and Barack Obama in 2009. Now, the word inauguration doesn't have to do only with presidential elections in the U.S. or anywhere. An inauguration, in general, is the act of starting something, like a business or a practice or a podcast. But what, you ask, does this have to do with animals? What's the animalogy? Well, for the answer, we have to go all the way back to ancient Rome, when during the Roman Republic, religion was organized under a strict system of priestly offices, one of the most powerful of which was made up of the 9 augurs. The main role of the augurs was to interpret the will of the gods by studying and interpreting the omens, aka the auguries, a practice referred to as taking the auspices. An augur was literally a diviner of birds. I cannot overstate how influential the augurs were in terms of public and private matters in Roman society. The augurs were consulted prior to any major decision, be it related to war, commerce, religion, and they were depended upon to predict whether the undertaking in question was auspicious or inauspicious, favorable or unfavorable. The function of the augurs wasn't necessarily to tell the future, and certainly not to enact policy or take action, but to discover whether or not the gods approved of a proposed course of action, especially be it military or political. From the Latin noun augur was derived the verb inaugurare, to foretell the future from the flight of birds. And this term was applied to the installation of someone in office after the appropriate omens or predictions had been determined. And this became the word we use to elect politicians into office with the hopes that their inauguration will prove to be auspicious. The Latin word inauguratio referred particularly to the ceremony by which things or persons were consecrated to the gods. By the time inaugurare reached English as inaugurate and inauguration, the association with the divination of birds had been forgotten. So let's pause to take a look at a few words that may have stood out for you and see the animal lurking in their common root. In the words augur, auguries, inaugurate, inaugural, inauguration, auspices, auspicious, and inauspicious, we have the root word avis, A-V-I-S, which is Latin for bird, and which also forms our words avian, the adjective that means related to or pertaining to birds, aviation, referring to the design and use of bird-like aircraft, and aviator, the operator of such aircraft, and aviary, a place where birds are kept and confined. And though we still use the word auspices to refer to positive signs, we also use it in the sense of protection, support, or patronage, as in the city animal shelter is no longer under the auspices of the police department, which is a true statement as it relates to my city's Oakland Animal Shelter. So all of these words are cognate: augur, auguries, inaugurate, inauguration, inaugural, auspices, auspicious, inauspicious, avian, aviation, aviator, and aviary. They all come from the Latin avis, which means bird. Now, I mentioned that the augurs read the omens, the auspices, to determine if it would be an auspicious or inauspicious outcome. And one of the ways they read the omens was to observe and interpret the flight patterns, bird calls, activities, and behaviors, and the entrails they obtained from bird sacrifices. Reading the signs of birds was not the only means of divination. Land animals were used as well, but we'll get to that a little later. And you can stand where these augurs once stood and practice a little augury yourself. When you go to Rome, you can visit Capitoline Hill near the Forum. It was the highest of the 7 hills on which ancient Rome was built, and it was the historic and religious center of the city. You can stand in Piazza del Campidoglio, look southeast as the augurs would have done, and observe the flights of birds. Now, you may divine nothing more than how beautiful birds are, but you will be standing just where those priests would have stood 1,000 years ago. So take a photo and share it with me. Now, there were 5 types of signs that augurs read. For our purposes, we're going to focus on 3: bird signs, birds feeding, and quadrupeds or 4-legged animals. There are other signs that were read as well, pretty much everything else not covered in the above categories, such as thunder and lightning and sneezing or stumbling. But for our purposes, we're focusing on bird signs, birds feeding, and quadrupeds. Before we get to the quadrupeds, first a quick shout out to the bipeds, because Animalogy is brought to you by the listeners of this podcast, many of whom you can see at animalogypodcast.com under podcast supporters, along with their beautiful words as to why they're proud to support this work. Some of them include David Cabrera and Alexandra Gray, Gwen Mayo, Michal Stone, Jennifer and Ben Ellis, Tim Anderson, Ulrich, Renee Marinkovic, Sylvie Raquel, and Peter Liu. If you'd like to make this podcast possible and enjoy some perks while you're at it, sign up at patreon.com/Colleen Patrick-Goudreau, and thank you for valuing this podcast. You are valued in return. So number 1 was the reading of the birds, but not all birds. The birds the Romans considered the best to give auguries were themselves divided into 2 classes. The ausigns, those who gave auguries by singing or using their voice in general, and the alites, those who gave auguries by their flight patterns. Now, the birds belonging in the first category, the singers, the ausigns, and that was just an old category, by the way, that we call passerine today. The birds considered passerine are those who have feet specialized for grasping branches and similar structures. They're perchers. But in ancient Rome, this category, ausigns of birds, consisted of songbirds or those with whom we associate vocalizations, singing, and chattering. And so the augurs turned to the ravens, the crows, the owls, and the hens. The birds belonging to the second category of flight, the alites, were first and foremost the eagle and the vulture, the latter of whom factors significantly into the mythical story about the founding of Rome. In fact, so do animals in general. So the story goes, Romulus and Remus, if you remember, were twin brothers conceived by their human mother Rhea and the god Mars. They were abducted by an ambitious rival and left to die by the Tiber River. They were saved by a female wolf who provided milk for them and a woodpecker who fed them, until they're taken in by a shepherd and his wife who raised them. They grow up, they claim their birthright, and decide to found a new city at the place of their rescue and upbringing. Romulus wants to found a new city on the Palatine Hill. Remus wants to found it on the Aventine Hill, both of which are of the 7 hills of Rome mentioned earlier, of which Capitoline Hill is one. They agree to determine the site through augury, but they disagree about what the auspices say. Remus sees 6 auspicious birds, which were believed to be vultures. Romulus sees 12. They argue, they fight, and Remus is killed. Romulus founds the new city, which he names after himself, calling it Rome. So wolves, woodpeckers, and vultures are all closely connected to the founding of the great city of Rome, as is augury. Now, I want to add another animalogical word related to our discussion about the augurs and the reading of birds. It's a word we took straight from Latin in the 15th century and really made no changes to, and whose meaning comes directly from this ancient art of divination, or superstition, as we might call it today. Its meaning affects many of us, including me, or to be more specific, those of us who are left-handed. Or I suppose more accurately, left-hand dominant. And that is the word sinister, the Latin word for left side, from which we get the English word sinister, meaning suggesting threatening harm or evil. And it's the opposite of dexter, meaning right side, from which we get the word dexterous, meaning skillful. And this notion comes from ancient Roman augury because birds who appeared on the left side when reading their flights were interpreted as being bad luck. Those on the right side, however, presaged good luck. And that idea is still with us today. I wasn't exactly born in the Middle Ages, but even I remember being made fun of. I was teased when I was young because I was and still am left-handed. There's still a notion, even today in the 21st century, as well as in that long ago 20th century in which I was born, that left-handed folks are unlucky or not to be trusted, to be somewhat suspicious of. And we lefties haven't exactly been regarded with positive attitude, even in French and Old English. The French word for left is gauche, a word borrowed directly into English as gauche that indicates awkwardness or lack of social graces. And this bias isn't reflected only in French and Latin. Even English has always favored the right over the left. The word right developed from Old English recht, which meant good, proper, fitting, straight. In the 12th century, to write with the right hand meant to write with the correct hand. The word left evolved from Old English lieft, which meant weak or foolish. And prejudice against the left can be seen in such English terms as two left feet, meaning awkward, and left-handed compliment, which is anything but a compliment. And that all goes back to our bird reading priests. Now, the second type of sign relevant to our discussion is the feeding of chickens. Initially, the augurs believed that any bird could give what was called a tripudium, a sign from birds based on their feeding. But later it became the practice to use only chickens, puli, for this purpose. The chickens were kept in a cage, and the person who cared for and oversaw them was called the pulerius. When the auspices were to be taken, the pulerius opened the cage and threw food to the chickens and then watched for signs. If the chickens refused to come out, or refused to eat, or uttered a cry, or beat their wings, or flew away, the signs were considered inauspicious. On the contrary, if they ate heartily, so that something fell from their mouth and struck the earth, it was considered favorable or auspicious. Now, if the Latin word pullus or pulerius sounds familiar to you, it's because it shares the Latin root of the French word pouletrie, from which we get our English words poultry and pullet. The word pullet, P-U-L-L-E-T, tends to be a term used primarily in the chicken, meat, and egg industries, referring to a hen under a year old. But that French word poule, P-O-U-L, was derived from Latin pullus, P-U-L-L-U-S, which meant not only a young chicken, but also any young animal. That Latin word pullus, P-U-L-L-U-S, is actually derived from a much older Proto-Indo-European word, pulo, P-U-L-O, which meant young of an animal. So the young of any animal. And from that Proto-Indo-European root, we also get the word pony, referring to a small horse. So that Proto-Indo-European root, pulo, P-U-L-O, gives us the words poultry, pullet, pullus, and pony. But again, remember, pulo meaning the young of any animal. It also gives us the words foal, F-O-A-L, meaning a young horse, usually under a year old, and filly, F-I-L-L-Y, a young female horse under 5 years old. This is often a term used in the horse racing industry or by horse riding enthusiasts. Filly, meaning a horse under 5 years old. Now, you might be asking, how did a word like pulo, that begins with a P sound, transition to a word like filly with an F sound? If you listen to the Animalogy episode, A History of English in 10 Minutes, you may remember that this is an example of the consonant shifts that took place when the Germanic languages were developing from their Proto-Indo-European roots. In this case, when the ancient consonant P sound became the English consonant F sound. And all of this from a simple discussion about bird reading augurs and chickens. So the habits of chickens, once they're given food, was a second type of augury. The third type we're focusing on for our purposes involved reading the habits of four-footed animals, which is, of course, exactly what the word quadrupedibus, or our modern word quadruped, means. Quadri, Latin for four, as in quadrangle, and the Latin stem ped, meaning foot. But as far as auguries went, they weren't really part of the original practice of the augurs, and they certainly were never employed by them in taking auspices on behalf of the state. They were really considered more of a mode of private divination. Thus, when a particular type of animal, specifically a quadruped or any four-legged animal, ran across someone's path or appeared in an unusual place or ran in a particular direction, it formed an augury. From merely watching the animals for auspicious or inauspicious signs from the gods, of course you also had animals who were killed as sacrifices to the gods, which involved cutting an animal's throat, then disemboweling him or her to look at the organs for ominous signs. The intestines and organs were examined to see what color and shape they were, and if they were twisted into knots or not. The intestines and other viscera were cut up and examined, then thrown into a fire on the altar to see how they would burn. If there was a bad omen, another animal would be killed and disemboweled, then another and another. Should anything about the sacrifice go wrong, it had to be repeated, but only after another additional sacrifice had been made to allay any potential anger of the gods over the failure of the first one. And so it's no surprise we have a word to characterize the killing of so many animals. A hecatomb means a large-scale slaughter. It refers literally to a sacrifice to the ancient Greek or Roman gods, consisting originally of 100 oxen or cattle. It's a Greek word built from hekaton, meaning 100, plus bous, B-O-U-S, meaning cattle, a root word which we will visit in much greater detail in future episodes of Animalogy, a root word from which we derive such words as bovine, bucolic, bugle, and even bulimia, but more on that route another time. I hope this first episode has piqued your interest enough to join me for the next installment of Animalogy. I hope to see you over at animalogypodcast.com, where you can read more, share, comment, and support this podcast. Until next time, on behalf of the animals, this is Colleen Patrick-Goudreau. Thanks for listening to Animalogy, changing the way we talk and think about animals.